new 100,000-seater stadium for United.
This will have an impact on Manchester United's ability to spend money, and that is a club and a squad which needs not just some surgery, it needs fundamental rebuild.
Manchester United has considerable debt already, so to layer on top of it 1, 2 billion, 3 billion, I think it's going to be a challenge.
Spurs spent just 42% of turnover on wages. So where is the rest of that money going?
Daniel doesn't go and decide who they're going to buy. What he does do is go and do the deal.
If you keep underspending on the wage bill, you will ultimately underperform on the field. And it's not a big surprise that it's starting to happen at Tottenham.
Hello, welcome to How Football Works. I'm Olly Clink. I'm joined this week by football finance expert Stefan Borson and the Sun's chief sports reporter Martin Lipton. Gentlemen, let's get straight into it, shall we? Because there's big news for Manchester United. And it appears Sir Jim Ratcliffe may have scored his first big victory. His dream of building a new 100,000-seater stadium for United, costing up to £2 billion, by the way, is set to become a reality. It's been one of Ratcliffe's key projects since he took over at Old Trafford, and now, with official government backing, it's the most concrete step forward in Ineos's ambition to build a Wembley of the North. Stefan, I'll start with you. In terms of the details of this, this is set to bring in 7.3 billion annually. Is it easy to see why the government have put their backing towards this project?
Yeah, so I think Ineos have got the timing perfect. We've just got the new government. There is a real drive towards growth projects and infrastructure. So I think they're in the right place at the right time. They've got a very supportive council in Manchester. I think the number 7.3 billion is, a classic management consultants type. Let's model something out with some quite wild assumptions, and we've come up with 7.3 billion. I mean, I think it could be anything, frankly. It's clearly very good for the city of Manchester. I think the challenge will be to sell it as some kind of northern project, which I think other cities around the north will be quite cynical about. But I think for Manchester, and I think almost less so for United, because I think for the club itself, whilst it's important the infrastructure is around it, they still have the challenge of how they get the money together to justify building such a major project. Because I think there will be very close scrutiny on government money going into the project itself. And I think
if there is government money going into the project, what is that going to be spent on? Surely not the direct building of the stadium. Might it be those surrounding areas of the stadium? Yeah,
so I think it'll be all the infrastructure around there, the communication links out to the stadium. I would imagine some changes to the way that the roads work around the stadium. So, if you're adding 15,000 homes and the infrastructure around that, plus, on a match day, another 15,000 people coming in, then clearly the infrastructure around that, the transport logistics are going to have to be better, and the general development, and I think they're going to move some of the freight rail as well. So all of that stuff is going to be within that mix of spend outside of Manchester United, which will facilitate the effective running of the stadium in a better way. But there's going to be very close scrutiny that government money is not funding Manchester United, given its ownership. And so, I think they can expect quite a lot of pushback. But as I say, I think great for Manchester. Big questions over how the rest of the north, the major cities in the north, the Leeds, Newcastle, Liverpool, how do they react to this kind of investment?
It's a really interesting point, that. But in terms of Manchester United, Martin, it's been a bit turbulent so far, to say the least, for Jim Ratcliffe and the new ownership there. Does this feel like a significant PR win for them?
Well, I think it will certainly make people think that they have concrete plans to build concrete, basically, and to make affect the change. When I was one of the small group of reporters who were invited in to speak to Jim Ratcliffe the day that the deal was progressed. So we went to his little offices next to Harrods in Knightsbridge, And even then, at that long chat, one of the things that came out of it for me was they were going to knock Old Trafford down, or at least rebuild, new build rather than rebuild. That was going to be the most likely end game scenario for lots of reasons, because they thought they could attract government finance. And interestingly enough, when that was put to the then government at the time, there was quite a strong pushback from DCMS officials. Now, maybe there's clearly been a change of government and perhaps the change of stance. This idea of a regeneration project for the north is important, I think, for this government, because they don't want to be accused of being too southern-centric, particularly with the talk of expansion of Heathrow to an extra terminal and Gatwick and all the infrastructure projects in the south again and the southeast, and we need to be seen to be a national government. So that's beneficial. I can't see how the full cost of this is going to be funded by government. That's not going to happen. There's going to have to be at least a significant investment from INEOS, which they're, I suspect, quite reluctant to do. They were looking to lean on government to support this significantly. But if there's an entertainment complex and housing projects and everything else and of that part of Manchester, then you can see why government would get behind. For United fans to see something being built new is great. But the most important thing for Manchester United fans is Manchester United Football Club and the team. And whatever's going on over the next 5, 6, 7 years, because these things aren't overnight, they take years.
So what do you think the timescale would be for this kind of project?
Well, Spurs in a smaller project took 4 years. Everton have been going for a much smaller project 4 years. Chelsea were looking to, if they were to rebuild Stamford Bridge, again, a smaller project, knocking down first, 5 to 6 years. This is, even though they just have a car park space they'll be able to use. I mean, they've got these huge car parks, they can build it on that. You've still got to put foundations in. That takes I can't see anything less than, and if it's a complex, not just a stadium, and all the infrastructure around it, and 6, 7 years minimum. And we know that infrastructure projects in this country never run to projected costs and normally take twice as long as expected to build because of the nature of the beast. There's all the other clearances you've got to get from councils, from the statutory authorities, from the trains. All these issues are huge. It takes 2 or 3 years just to get the project greenlit by local council, and presumably on something like this scale, we'd have to go to the government as well to finalise it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the big win is. To have the government support, for it to be a centrepiece project comparable as announced today. I did see it being talked about in the same terms as Heathrow third runway. If it is a government-sponsored project, then I think that will ease some of the planning issues.
Given the government strict statements being made by Starmer at the moment about we're going to push and ease the NIMBY element, stop them being able to block these things from judicial review, etc.
Yeah, so I think that will be the key win, actually. We can all talk about the numbers. As I say, I think it'd be very, very hard for there to be any government investment in the stadium or the Manchester United-owned facilities themselves. So I think the key win will be how can they ease the whole process such that they can make it quicker, they can ensure that that it doesn't take 4 years. The cost of a project taking 4 years is going to be hundreds of millions of pounds extra versus a project that takes 2 years. So it's going to be very important for them to have an efficient planning process without the challenges, without very lengthy delays along that way. And I think that's what this government support is going to give them and the council support is going to give them. There is then the question around the funding of it. And that is not a straightforward question. And we've spoken about this before in relation to a number of clubs. It's all very well talking about INEOS. At the end of the day, INEOS are only a 25% shareholder in Manchester United. They are not going to put a whole load of money in unless it dilutes the shares of the Glazers. It's not clear yet whether the Glazers are going to be prepared to accept equity investment into Manchester United to then invest in the stadium that will then dilute the Glazers, or whether it's going to have to be even more debt. Remember, Manchester United has considerable debt already. So to layer on top of it, 1, 2 billion, 3 billion potentially. I mean, it's not clear that this can be done on this very tight £2 billion budget. is it possible that United can get funding as an organisation for that amount of money? I think it's going to be a challenge. So there's still big issues regarding the funding of the infrastructure build above and beyond the government intervention, which I think will be an assistance, but is not the complete answer.
And then you've also got the consequences on the football club. Arsenal were significantly hit by the cost of their move to the Emirates. Tottenham took out massive loans, and we know that was one of the reasons they didn't spend for a period. Everton's financial problems, which led to points deductions, were significantly related to costs and loans, etc., on the stadium move. This will have an impact on Manchester United's ability to spend money, and that is a club and a squad which needs not just some surgery, it needs fundamental rebuild, isn't it? Because it's a mess. It's not fit for purpose at the moment. And how do you fund that, given the restrictions on what you can spend and the extra debt that's going to be landed on the ownership in some form over a significant period of time?
Yeah, I don't think there's been any build anywhere in the world that hasn't impacted the football operations of the club from a financial perspective. It clearly takes money, even if the projects are ring-fenced as separate projects, it clearly takes money away from the investment on the footballing side for a period. The only question is how long that period goes on for. And, as Martin says, the timing of that is not ideal for Manchester United right now. And that's just another challenge that they're going to have to deal with if they go for a very major project.
I think dramatic cuts in interest rates would help them appreciably over the next 5 years. If we get down to Japanese-style no interest rates, that would be useful.
Well, this is a very, very significant point. When you go back to looking at probably Daniel Levy's greatest ever success at Tottenham is nothing that anybody really focuses on.
Timing.
And is probably about the interest rate that he's paying on most of the debt, because he managed to make two decisions. One was a fortunate timing of building the stadium, but the other one was to fix the interest rate. And he fixed the interest rates when we had historically low interest rates. We don't have that luxury anymore. So if all things being equal, if interest rates do stay higher for longer, just the interest cost of building a new stadium is going to be multiples of what Tottenham are paying. And again, it's another big challenge on the financing side.
Indeed. And unfortunately, it's not all good news at the moment for Manchester United fans, because Jim Ratcliffe was back in the headlines earlier this week, this time over his threat to raise ticket prices to £66 per match, with concessions for pensioners and children both dropped. The club's dire financial situation has seen them lose $300 million over the last 3 years, and coupled with the restrictions of PSR and FFP, they're looking at new ways to generate revenue, with an official club statement saying they must act now. Martin, I want to start with you on this, because Manchester United did release a statement that they sent to some fan groups who were protesting these changes. They said they don't expect the fans to make up all of the shortfall, but that they do need to look at their ticketing strategy to make sure they're charging the right amount. That, to me, felt a bit contradictory. In your view, are they exploiting fans in this situation to try and solve their own financial problems?
I'm not saying, I wouldn't say exploiting, because the reality is, if local fans don't turn up, tourists will. It's Manchester United. People will pay. In some ways, actually, they are seeking to attract non-traditional Manchester United fans. The heritage fans, the legacy fans, whatever you want to call them, are of less interest to any club than new fans. Because new fans, one-off fans, spend money they'll pay whatever it takes to get in, and they'll spend money in the club shop. And it's a deliberate business strategy pursued by an awful lot of football clubs, because they want to milk the easiest cash cow, which is those who are 1 day, 2 day visitors. And that means that they're going to be willing to price out traditional long-term supporters, because they're business people and they don't care.
Do you think there's an understanding then about the threat that has to the actual atmosphere at a ground when you force out supporters who've been going week in, week out for a very long time?
It should do, but it doesn't. It's about money. It's about business. And I think we've seen that at many clubs. You go to pretty much all of the bigger Premier League clubs, and there are an awful lot of people who come. Is there one visit in their lives or once a season to watch that club? They watch it in wherever they are in the world. If you're a Korean, you want to go and watch Tottenham once to see Son play. If you're based in the US, you go to United or Liverpool or wherever because you want to go to these places because they're shrines almost to you, and you'll pay whatever it takes. Because if you're coming all that way and you're spending £1,000 on your ticket, the flight ticket, you don't mind spending 300 quid on your match ticket. You spend for 200 quid in the club shop. Ka-ching, ka-ching. It's what clubs are going to take advantage of.
But, I mean, Stefan, despite all that, I think the frustration as well from Manchester United fans is they look at how their club have operated so far under Ineos. You know, the sacking of Erik ten Hag with a huge payout, that was a clear mistake. They messed up the hire of Dan Ashworth as well. Can you understand their frustrations when they look at how much money that the clubs seemingly have wasted on other things off the pitch? And it seems as if they're then looking at these ticket prices and saying, well, we need to make as much as we can out of the fans.
So the idea that there's not enough being generated from Old Trafford on match day, I would say is wrong. It is possible that if you were to compare Manchester United's average ticket price with a London club, then yeah, sure, it's probably materially lower. But that doesn't mean that the reason why Manchester United are close on PSR is because the fans aren't paying enough for their tickets. I would say it's very clear, and I think it's treating the fans as fools to suggest that the reason that they're close to the PSR limits is because the fans aren't paying enough through the gate. It's just not the case. I mean, as you've said yourself, they've had a change of manager numerous times over the last decade. Each time you change a manager, it has an impact on the players that have been purchased and the need to move those players out and players becoming, surplus to requirements. So the idea that this is all about putting it on the fans and what they're paying through the gate, I think is very misguided, just from a PR perspective, but also it's a gaslighting of the fans.
Can I ask, though, on a more wide issue, because it's really interesting here, Martin's already pointed out that the clubs are going to do whatever they can to make as much money out of the match-going fan as possible, whether that's bringing in more tourists or not. We've mentioned the phrase PSR there a lot. Do you feel that PSR in its current guise, because of the way it's changed the way clubs are viewing match-day revenue, has cost the average fan more generally? I know the clubs are obviously the ones making that decision to raise the prices, but it's because they're trying to get around these rules.
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated. First of all, I don't accept that the clubs are blindly going into a situation where they're just saying, we just want the maximum yielding fan on a particular match day. I think the clubs are well aware of the importance of both season ticket holders from a financial perspective, in that they effectively are paying early and they're paying up front, versus a match day fan where you have less certainty and they're coming in on a one-off basis. And actually a lot of the revenue is being lost at the moment in ticket touting and is not actually being captured by the club. So it's all very well.
Well, we saw that with Manchester United and the Rangers fans who managed to get in the,
correct,
in the home end.
And this is an issue across the game. My view is that clubs are well aware of the importance, both financially but also from the atmosphere perspective. And the game will not be the same if every game is just day trippers. And the fans and the clubs are well aware of that. They need the loud and vociferous home fans, season ticket holders, there every week, fanatical fans as a base. And then on top of that, you add on high value fans on a day basis or on a corporate basis. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. That is what we see in a number of industries, such as the airlines, where you will have most of the plane will be economy, but then there'll be a substantial amount that will be high value, first class or premium seats. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself. So I think we just need to, the clubs are not stupid. They do understand the value. I do think, however, that the clubs, and there are a number of the bigger clubs in particular that have done this, have tried to use PSR as an excuse to raise prices on the backdrop of years and years of very stable pricing. And really what we're seeing now is a catch-up, because we had long periods where ticket prices were frozen. We then had COVID and people felt reluctant. But what's really happened is all throughout that period we've had very high inflation. So even above and beyond player wages and everything else, we've had very high operating costs for these clubs. So if you look at a number of clubs, they've had 20, 25% increases in the operating expenses of a club. There are genuine needs to put the prices up on an annualised basis just to continue to pay the bills. But to use PSR as the excuse, or we've got to penalise the fans more, when really we all know the key issue in terms of the profit and loss of a club has tended to be the spending on wages and for a lot of these clubs, the very extensive spending on compensation to management teams going in and out. And that's happened at Chelsea, it's happened at Manchester United, and it's happened at other clubs where tens of millions of pounds have gone out. You can't pay out millions of pounds to failed players and managers and then say, oh, we need to put up ticket prices.
Martin, do you go along with that there is an overuse of PSR as an excuse? I mean, so Jim Ratcliffe is someone that you've obviously spoken to. Do you think that PR-wise he's getting this wrong?
Look, well, it's a way of massaging the truth to a degree that it's an excuse you can make for acts you do. It's trying to cover the reality of your act, looking to say, well, we have to do this because. Whereas, of course, if you run your business properly, you don't have to. The reality is you're choosing to make this. But also, if you put up prices by 10% across the board, each ticket, that probably has an average of 300 grand per club, per match, in terms of income, which is negligible.
Ocean,
it's one player. It's one big player's salary.
It is.
But it hurts the individuals who are paying it because it costs them. If most people who are going to football, that 10% is a lot of money to them because they've already budgeted, often to the max, to pay the current price, and it's what you're going to put on the. It's holidays you have to think about, or the car you were going to change, or what if your boiler goes bust and how are you going to pay for that? These things don't impact the minds of football executives because they don't have those worries.
So you would say that they're out of touch then, most football executives?
I think most rich people are out of touch with reality because they don't live in the world that the majority of people live in. Of course they don't. Well, if you can't count your money, how do you have to think about budgeting?
I don't agree with that overall. I think it underestimates the quality of the people who are involved in the pricing discussions within the organisations and within the clubs. I mean, there's huge numbers of people involved in getting the pricing right within a football club. It's not, this is not Sir Jim Ratcliffe in his £1 billion ivory tower saying, right, we are now just going to do this come what may. I don't.
No, I agree. I said that. It's not sod you. But it's like
there's you've got to get that balance right between caring about the reality of the matchday going fan and balancing the needs of the club from a business perspective. And I think the thing that people miss, and I'm not defending the clubs in this regard, I'm just explaining it, but the thing that people miss about 5 and 10% incremental increases on an annualised basis is the compounding element of that. And it's not just about 5% this year, because next year it'll be 5% on top of the 5%. And by the time you get to 10 and 15 years, the ticket prices have doubled. And that's what the clubs are focused on. They're looking for small incremental increases along the lines of inflation or just above inflation so that they then can continue to move the prices up the scale.
Well, what about the removal of concessions then? At Manchester United?
I think those are PR mistakes. I mean, I think, and it's just been the same at Spurs as well.
I've been discussed at Arsenal as well, hasn't it?
And that supports Martin's, point about people making, uneducated decisions on pricing away from the reality of the real fan. That does support Martin's perspective. But I think that we have to assume that the clubs have gone through an internal process to consider the impact of that. And as much as we might sit here and go, this is just unfair, that you would take away concessions and you would make it extremely expensive even to take a child or a pensioner, you have to assume that they've gone through the process of working through that and thinking about from both sides. But I think a lot of it is about clumsy communication as much as anything. But long term, the clubs will not allow a situation where they freeze the ticket prices for a decade. They just won't. That is gone. And I think the more American ownership that we have in the game, you can forget it in terms of that, because they look at what's being charged in the US in particular, and they are going to want those ticket prices to move forward on a regular basis.
Moving on, the financial services company Deloitte has released its annual Money League for 2025. This list ranks the highest revenue-generating football clubs around the world for the previous season. Real Madrid topped the list for the second year in a row, what a shock, and make history as the first team to generate over €1 billion of revenue in a single season. But how did the Premier League clubs fare? Martin, if I start with you, what did you think were the key takeaways in terms of the Premier League clubs from this list? And we'll discuss your own team, Tottenham, in just a moment. I might just throw that in before. What other than Spurs were the key takeaways for you?
Actually, not a lot has changed. The six that you'd expect to be in the top 10 were in the top 10. The other three or four you thought would be in the top 20 were in the top 20. English football is a huge financial behemoth. There's no question of that. The resources of the Premier League clubs is enormous. Manchester City's income of, 700 million plus pounds, 838 million euros is a huge sum. But what was interesting, I thought, first of all, was that Arsenal had jumped above Liverpool and Chelsea for the first time in 8 years, off the back of a Champions League run last season, a very successful couple of seasons. Remember, Chelsea weren't in Europe this season. That's going to impact them again. Spurs were back in Europe, but were in Spurs weren't in Europe last season at all. They'd previously been in the Champions League, so therefore there's a 40-50 million pound immediate differential in terms of forecast income for them. But the actual buoyancy of the clubs, even though Spurs weren't in Europe, they still actually slightly increased their income revenues, still over £500 million, a lot of money. Arsenal up to over 600 million, huge sum of money. The buoyancy of the clubs, even in difficult financial circumstances globally, is a standout feature. And remember that the Premier League broadcast deal for next season has gone slightly up for the domestic portion, but significantly up for the overseas portion. So it's going to average about 18%, something like that overall, because the overseas portion is now bigger than the domestic portion. All the other major leagues, I think the Spanish league has gone up slightly domestically. The others have gone down. The French broadcast deal is basically halved, and it may even go further down. So the differential between and the growth of the Premier League, or the strength of the Premier League, was only to be exacerbated over the coming years, because it's still a growing league when others are in decline. So we're going to see the English teams continuing to fill, and some of the teams that are now 11th to 20th are going to be 11th to 15th, and maybe even ghosted into the top 10 over the coming years.
Stefan, I just want to point out Arsenal. How significant for you is that leap from 10th up to 7th for them?
Yeah, so there's two things happening for Arsenal. I remember the Money League 2025 is a reflection of the numbers for 23-24, so the numbers to the end of June of the season just gone. So it's not the current season. They are going to continue to be right up there, because Champions League this season is going to be a bonanza for Arsenal. They're almost certainly going to do over 100 million euros, probably over 100 million pounds on that side of things. And there's two things that come out of the report. One on the positive side in terms of revenue, which is on the commercial side. And for a long time, Arsenal almost inexplicably have been quite a long way behind the other major English teams. And they're finally starting now to bump up against Chelsea, getting closer to Tottenham at the moment. Tottenham are still about 20% ahead of Arsenal, which, from the outside you'd think was slightly perverse, especially because, remember, Arsenal have another property in the naming rights for the stadium that's sold, and Tottenham do not. So it is slightly surprising that they're still not at that level, but they have grown well. The other thing to watch, however, is Arsenal's wage bill has gone up very dramatically in the season 23-24, and will have gone up again this season. It went up over 30% from the prior season, which has put real distance between them and Tottenham. I think the other big takeaway from the Money League is just the dominance of the Premier League. It's almost the Premier League plus Real, Barca, PSG and Bayern Munich. And it will be more so for the season that's coming up.
Let's talk about Spurs, shall we? Because they and their chairman, Daniel Levy, are under significant pressure at the moment. And I'm not sure fans will be pleased to see these figures. Spurs rank at the top or the bottom, whichever way you want to look at it, for wages spent as a percentage of turnover. Last season, the club spent just 42% of turnover on wages. So where is the rest of that money going? Martin, I'll start with you on this. I mean, when you look at the money table, Spurs made higher commercial revenue than both Arsenal and Chelsea, yet their wages are still so low. Can you understand why fans would be so frustrated, including yourself?
Well, fans might be, but it's a sensible business decision. Let's be honest. It isn't that they're only paying tuppence halfpenny to wages. They've still got a pretty healthy wage bill. What they have got is a remarkably efficient commercial enterprise on the scene. They have got gate receipts of over 5 million for every home game. They've got a really clever way of keeping fans in the stadium because it's actually cheaper to drink in the stadium than it is in the pubs next door, and the bars are open for before the game and after. It's a really nice place to go and watch football. The only problem is the football at the moment, but that's what happens.
But that's the point, isn't it? Really, that's why they're so frustrated.
Also, they have spent a lot of money. They wasted £60 million on Ndombele, who was supposed to be the great hope for them. The most unprofessional footballer I've ever seen. He couldn't last 45 minutes, let alone 90. That was maybe a recruitment issue, but at the time everyone think, what a great signing. This summer they spent money. They spent 60 million on Solanke. They still spent quite. If you actually look at spending, they're in the top 4 or 5. It isn't that they don't spend money. What they don't do is overpay, and there is a genuine. You always suspect that there's a pretty clear sort of link between the amount you spend on wages and performance. As a rule, the more you spend in gross terms, you end up with a better squad and better players and better performances. You don't always. Tottenham have historically, I would say, on about the 6th highest wage bill, overperformed because their average position is between sort of 5th and 6th over the last 10 years.
So in your view then, is this criticism of Daniel Levy justified?
Well, it's all about the fact that they're not playing very well. If they were in the top 3 or 4, if they were playing where they were this time last season, these criticisms wouldn't be made. The criticisms come because of the on-field performances.
And so that's the manager's fault. Obviously, he's the man who's hired the manager.
Well, also, to a degree, but what I would say that Daniel, when there's a deal, Daniel doesn't go and decide who they're going to buy. What he does do is go and do the deal. The one thing they absolutely needed in January was a goalkeeper. On January the 1st, he flies out to Prague and signs the goalkeeper. Now, would they be better if they'd made some purchases this January? Absolutely. But the players they could get in now, would they be playing in the first team in 2 months' time if all the injured players, and they are basically half the squad is injured, were fit again? Probably not. So it's a difficult sell as well to tell you who do you go and get who's in January. You buy in January out of desperation, mainly, or out of fear. Fear being of relegation, but that also is desperation. I don't think at any point yet Tottenham think they're going to be relegated. They still could be the way they're playing, but I don't think the suspicion will be if they get 3 or 4 of those players back when it matters, they'll get to 45 points, they'll be okay, and they could still win one of the cups. But the fans are looking at 20 years, 24 years with one trophy under ENIC rule. And the common link in that whole period is, of course, the chairman stroke president, whatever different titles that Daniel's had over his period in charge. He is the sort of the lightning rod for all the frustration and grievances and angst and everything else. And that's understandable from a fan perspective.
Yeah. Do you go along with what he said there, that Levy, because he's been that constant for so long, they've tried all sorts of different managers. Like Martin points out, especially recently, he has spent money. Are the mistakes maybe from the past where he didn't put money behind managers like Mourinho and managers like Conte as much as he may have could have?
I think it's a complicated equation to assess Daniel Levy and Spurs. And the first thing to say is Daniel Levy is an owner, not just an operator. And people forget that actually his indirect ownership of Tottenham is very, very substantial, over 25%. So he's not a hired hand as people perceive him, that can be just kind of replaced in the way that, say, Woodward was at United. He's much more intrinsic to that. He's an owner. I think you also have to say that in defence of Daniel Levy, the club has outperformed its wage spell consistently over the last 10 years. So they have consistently been at a discount to the other clubs in the top 4, and they have qualified for the Champions League. So I think that's to his credit. Likewise, they've built the most incredible stadium, again, to his credit. So lots of really impressive things have happened at Tottenham under his stewardship. However, I cannot agree that there is not a story in Tottenham having probably the lowest ratio in Europe. So not just here across this money league. It's hard to think of a single club who have a wages to turnover ratio of 42%. Certainly nobody in the Premier League in any position, and I would struggle to think of somebody off the top of my head who has that in the whole of Europe. So they do have, from a ratio perspective, and it's a blunt instrument, I accept, but they do have a noticeably low revenue to wage ratio. It is very materially below the clubs they're competing with, and that will be a problem. There's only a certain number of years you can continue to outperform your wage bill. We know that from all of the research that's been done in respect of it. Now, whilst there's not a direct correlation between wages and end position, there is certainly a direction of travel whereby if you keep underperforming, if you keep underspending on the wage bill, you will ultimately underperform on the field. And it's not a big surprise that it's starting to happen at Tottenham, especially in the post-Harry Kane era. And it's potentially true that Kane and to an extent Son, over that period, kind of papered over some of those cracks and maybe delivered value in excess of what their headline wage bill was. I don't think a 42% wage bill to turnover ratio is sustainable. I think it will lead to fans causing protests and not accepting that situation, and it is going to have to be addressed. And the problem that they have in terms of transfers, I think, is similar to most clubs. Not every transfer works, but you can't have a situation where the club is even threatened with relegation for a club of this size. That will be a point at which they'll have to take action, both in terms of the manager and also in terms of the spend. So, look, I think there's a lot of positive in that in Tottenham's financial performance. And in the job that Daniel Levy's done. And if you speak to anybody in the game, people universally have positive things to say about him as a business operator and as an owner. The problem is he's almost been too smart. That to me says there's somebody that's actually under-investing as opposed to getting it just about right. And then you see the league position and you go, there may be certain reasons this season, but it does seem to suggest that the balance of investment versus return is not quite right.
Well, as things heat up in the transfer market with managers, chairmen and sporting directors on the phone to agents to sell for the right price and buy the right player, for our explainer today, we wanted to look at how exactly a deal is done. And earlier, I caught up with Bradford City's head of football operations, David Sharp, and I began by asking him what his day-to-day role in January looks like during their frantic transfer window.
It's the most difficult window. Obviously, the summer's a much longer period from the season ending to the end of the August window. So you can be a lot more prepared and have all the sort of everything mapped out, because you know who's out of contract, you know what you need. Whereas in January, you can have all the best plans in the world, and within a week or two of the window opening, it gets ripped up because you have bids for players that you weren't expecting to get bids for. There's a snowball effect or a domino effect with deals that happen across the country that affect the players that you target, or the players that you think you're trying to move on. So it's a very, very difficult window to navigate through. And then you've got games as well, which doesn't help. It's a really difficult period because you have the manager focusing on results and trying to achieve your goals and keep that squad together. You're trying to focus on the long term. It's a real difficult balance.
Given everything that's gone on with PSR, that's the buzzword we hear so much nowadays, it feels like these windows have got a bit quieter, especially in January. Has that been a bit of a blessing in disguise for owners and chairmen?
I believe so, yeah. PSR it affects obviously Premier League clubs more than it would League One, League Two, Championship. We still have financial fair play rules in place, however, the difference what the Premier League has to operate under. And they had a little deadline themselves in the middle of summer, which was nothing to do with the transfer deadline. It was to do with the accounting deadline, and that's not something we have to work towards at our level. But yeah, it's there's decisions that you have to make, and the manager doesn't want to make them, and you have to make them for him and sort of dictate to the manager at times players they want to keep, but you're thinking about the long term and potential sort of penalties that you might get or financial implications that you might have be imposed upon you. So it's a real difficult balance in trying to maintain sort of being successful on the pitch as well as operating the business and trying to be successful off it as well.
We obviously know that there's so many long-term deals, as you mentioned there, that take place. But in terms of short-term deals, because that tends to be what happens in January, it might be that the manager has asked you for a certain player, he might have injuries in a certain position. What's the quickest you've ever done a deal from identifying a target to getting the name signed on the dotted line?
Oh, a few hours at Wigan on deadline day. When I was there, we signed 7 or 8 players on deadline day in the January window. All off the back of selling a player that for a substantial amount of money. I think it was 6 or 7 million at the time. And there was players that came about on deadline day that we hadn't discussed but became available on the last day of the window, and within to sort of identify them at 7 p.m. at night, they were signing for us at 9 o'clock at night. So yeah, but normally that's not the way that you want to work or operate. You normally want to be a bit more patient about a deal and spend a lot more time doing your homework and due diligence and watching the player, etc. But deadline day deals normally aren't great ones, to be honest with you. And since then, I don't like to be too active on deadline day because sometimes you regret the decisions, unless it's a loan player, a short-term 6-month loan, which isn't a long-term commitment, and it's not the end of the world if it doesn't work out.
If it does get that hectic, only a matter of hours, how much coordination is required between yourself and the manager and the scouting team? How quickly can you come to a decision like that, as you say, in just a matter of hours or even minutes in those scenarios?
Yeah, very quickly, and that's why you have to be all present with each other on days towards the end of the window and be in the office together, the head of recruitment, the chief exec, myself, The owner has to be on the phone, the manager has to be there, and straight away you might identify a player. Normally it's an agent calling you up saying this player's been made available by the parent club or by the club they're at, and you have to be really quick because there might be 2, 3, 4 other clubs, 5 other clubs in for that player. So you have to be very quick off the mark and try and wrap it up. But like I said, sometimes those quick deals when you rush into them end up sometimes they work out, but very rarely when you don't spend enough time on them. And you'd see the best clubs in sort of the way they operate now, whether it be Brentford, Brighton, etc., who do incredible stuff in the transfer market. They would be speaking to the agents of a player and identify them a long time before they actually sign. And you're talking sort of 6 months to a year at least. Whereas at our level, you've got to be a bit more. A player might not be in the squad for 4 or 5 games before the January window opens, and all of a sudden become available when you didn't know he was available, and you have to be very quick to react.
In terms of your time at Wigan, when you joined the club as chairman, you were just 23 years old, which was a record at the time, one of the youngest bosses we've ever seen of a club. What was that experience like?
It was strange because it's not something that you're used to, I suppose, and to be thrown in at that age was strange but enjoyable. I remember when my grandfather did stand down. We played Norwich away on a Tuesday night, and I'd only become the chairman, I think, on the Monday. I'm walking out for the game at Carrow Road into the director's box, and there must have been sort of 10, 11, 12 cameras pointing up at me, and it was just something that you're not quite prepared for. It was. I loved it, and it's something that I learned a lot from, and I'm still in football now, still working in it, still love it. But you are thrown into the deep end, and it's more. It was people obviously questioning my age, which it's not surprising. It's normally you imagine chairman to be in a sort of a bit more experienced than a 23-year-old, having players that were most of the squad were older than me. So it was great. I loved it. Is it something I'd recommend to every 23-year-old? No. But I was fortunate to be in that position to have the chance to do it.
David, thank you very much indeed there. David Sharp, Head of Football Operations at Bradford City. That's it from us this week on How Football Works. Thanks for your company. If you want to get involved, post your comments below, and remember, you can also watch and listen to the show on Spotify. Thank you very much for your company, and thanks to our panellists Stefan Borson, Martin Lipton and David Sharp. See you next time.